In Phoenix, Arizona, a disabled veteran in a wheelchair was about to file a routine disability appeal. What started as a simple insurance office visit took a shocking turn when they encountered systematic fraud targeting America's heroes. James Hunt wasn't your typical claimant. For 8 years, he had worked as a federal agent specializing in white-collar crime, known for his unwavering sense of justice. When he witnessed Derek Hoffman's callous dismissal of legitimate veteran claims, he had no idea he was walking into a conspiracy reaching federal law enforcement's highest levels. Hunt's undercover infiltration would expose a $50 million fraud network. What began as one man's disability fight would become a federal investigation demanding an impossible choice between duty and humanity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wheelchair's rubber tires whispered against the polished linoleum as James Hunt navigated the narrow corridor toward Derek Hoffman's office. The morning sun slanted through dust-streaked windows, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch like fingers across the institutional beige walls of Pinnacle Insurance. Everything about this place felt designed to discourage. The uncomfortable plastic chairs bolted to the floor, the outdated veteran resource posters with curled edges advertising services that had been discontinued years ago, the reception desk, positioned just high enough to force wheelchair users to crane their necks upward. James had practiced this moment countless times. His manufactured limp, the way his left shoulder drooped slightly from an imaginary shrapnel wound, the careful balance between hope and resignation that should flicker across his face. Federal agent James Hunt understood the mechanics of deception. But James Hunt, the Vietnam veteran, that fiction felt heavier today, more real than it should. "Mr. Hunt?" Derek Hoffman's voice carried across the waiting area with practiced professional warmth that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Come on back." The man who approached looked exactly like his file photos, mid-50s, still carrying himself with military bearing despite the expanding waistline and thinning hair. Former Army, discharged for conduct violations that his personnel file described. In bureaucratic euphemisms, James catalogued the details as they shook hands: manicured nails, expensive watch, shoes that cost more than most veterans' monthly disability checks. "Coffee?" Derek gestured toward a machine in the corner that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the Clinton administration. "No, thank you." James maneuvered his wheelchair to face Derek's desk, noting the positioning of the security. Cameras, one in each corner, older models that probably had decent audio pickup. "Appreciate you taking the time to see me." Derek's office told its own story. The wall behind his desk displayed his military service photo alongside certificates from insurance industry organizations. A small American flag sat next to his computer monitor, the kind you could buy at any gas station for $3. But it was what wasn't there that caught James's attention. No photos of veteran appreciation events, no evidence of community involvement, no signs that this man who processed veteran claims had any connection to the community he served. So, Derek settled into his chair and pulled up a file on his computer screen. Disability claim for service-connected PTSD and chronic pain. Vietnam, 1971 to 1973. His fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "Let's see what we're working with here." James had spent weeks crafting the documentation. Medical records that would pass casual inspection, service records that aligned with real units and real battles, psychological evaluations that reflected the genuine struggles of countless veterans he'd interviewed during his investigation. The fictional James Hunt had served with the 101st Airborne, been wounded near Firebase Charlie, struggled with nightmares and phantom pain for 50 years. The real James Hunt's grandfather had told him stories about different kinds of wounds, the one that came from being turned away from jobs because your last name was Chen, from being told you weren't American enough despite 3 generations of citizenship. Those stories had shaped James's understanding of systematic discrimination, had led him to law enforcement, had ultimately brought him to this moment. "Medical documentation looks comprehensive," Derek said, though James noticed he'd barely glanced at the thick folder. "Dr. Martinez did your psychological evaluation?" "Yes, sir. 3 sessions over 2 months." James had memorized every detail of the fictional appointments. She was very thorough. Derek's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. James recognized the look. He'd seen it in countless interrogation rooms when suspects realized they might be dealing with someone who'd done their homework. "Dr. Martinez is thorough, sometimes too thorough, if you know what I mean. Tends to find problems where they might not necessarily exist." The statement hung in the air like smoke. James felt something cold settle in his stomach as he understood what Derek was really saying. Dr. Martinez, whose real evaluation sat in similar files throughout Phoenix, was being dismissed, not for incompetence, but for competence, for finding real trauma in real veterans. "I'm not sure I follow," James said carefully, maintaining his cover persona's deferential tone. "Well," Derek leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming against the desk. "The thing is, Mr. Hunt, we've seen a lot of claims like this lately. Vietnam veterans suddenly remembering trauma from 50 years ago. It's funny how these memories surface right around the time Congress talks about expanding benefits." James's hands tightened on his wheelchair's armrests. He forced his voice to remain steady. "I've been dealing with this since I came home. Only recently found out I might qualify for benefits." Derek was barely listening now, his attention focused on his computer screen. "Says here you've been employed consistently since your discharge. Management position at a logistics company. Doesn't sound like someone suffering from debilitating PTSD." The casual cruelty of it struck James like a physical blow. The implication that functional veterans couldn't be suffering, that trauma had to render someone completely helpless. To be valid, that adaptation and resilience were somehow evidence of fraud rather than strength. "I've worked hard to build a life," James said quietly. "That doesn't mean the nightmares stopped." Derek's smile was sharp-edged and patronizing. "I'm sure they haven't, but we have to look at objective evidence, not subjective complaints. The fact is, your military records show no mention of psychological wounds at discharge, no Purple Heart for this alleged shrapnel injury, no contemporaneous documentation of trauma." James had anticipated this argument. Real veterans faced it constantly. The catch-22 of needing documentation for trauma that the military had actively discouraged reporting. "Sir, in 1973, PTSD wasn't even a recognized diagnosis. Soldiers who complained about nightmares were told to suck it up or risk their careers." "That may be true," Derek conceded, with the air of someone making a generous allowance, "but we can't make decisions based on what might have happened 50 years ago. We need concrete evidence." Through the office's glass wall, James watched Derek's daughter Rebecca organizing files at her desk. Her movements seemed agitated, and she kept glancing toward her father's office with an expression he couldn't quite read. Concern? Embarrassment? She was young, maybe late 20s, with the kind of earnest demeanor that suggested she'd taken this job, believing she could help people. Derek was already reaching for his stamp. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to deny this claim, Mr. Hunt. Insufficient evidence to establish service connection." The speed of it was breathtaking. James glanced at his watch. 12 minutes. Derek had spent 12 minutes reviewing documentation that represented months of his fictional alter ego's courage to seek help. Around them, James could hear the sounds of other claims being processed with similar efficiency, a conveyor belt of denials. "Is there an appeal process?" James asked, though he already knew the answer. "Of course. You can request a formal review, though I should warn you, appeals take months and rarely overturn initial decisions." Most veterans find it easier to move on with their lives. James accepted the denial letter with hands that he made sure trembled slightly. The paper felt heavier than it should, weighted with the knowledge of how many real veterans had held similar letters, had felt the same crushing disappointment and institutional betrayal. As he prepared to leave, Rebecca Hoffman approached her father's office. Through the glass, James watched her knock hesitantly on the doorframe. "Dad?" Mrs. Patterson called about her husband's claim. She wanted to know if there was any update. Derek's expression darkened. "Tell her the claim is still under review. And Rebecca, in the future, refer all inquiries to me directly. Don't discuss specific cases with claimants or their families." Rebecca's face flushed. "I just thought, that's the problem, don't think. Follow protocol." James felt something twist in his chest as he watched Rebecca retreat to her desk, her shoulders squared with what looked like suppressed anger. Patterson. The name meant something. James Patterson, the Iraq veteran whose denied claim had sparked this entire investigation. The man whose homelessness and suffering had convinced James's superiors that systematic fraud at Pinnacle Insurance warranted federal attention. "Mr. Hunt?" Derek's voice pulled James back to the moment. "Was there anything else?" "No, sir." James folded the denial letter and tucked it into his jacket pocket. "Thank you for your time." The wheelchair's path back through the narrow corridor felt different now, heavy with the weight of institutional contempt and casual cruelty. James had spent months preparing for this moment, had thought he understood what he was up against. But experiencing Derek Hoffman's systematic dehumanization firsthand, even as a fraud, felt like standing too close to something toxic. Outside, the Phoenix sun beat down mercilessly on the parking lot asphalt. James sat in his specially modified van for a long moment, letting the air conditioning wash over him while he processed what had just happened. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Kim, his handler. "How did it go?" James stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, "Denied, as expected." What he didn't type was how the experience had felt more real than any undercover operation he'd ever run. How Derek's casual dismissal of trauma had triggered something unexpected in his own chest. How Rebecca Hoffman's discomfort suggested there might be conscience left in that building after all. And how the weight of his grandfather's stories about discrimination and institutional betrayal suddenly felt less like history and more like an active wound that had never really healed. James started the van and pulled out of the parking lot, knowing he had a meeting with Sarah to report his findings. But first, he had a veteran support group to attend. The fictional James Hunt had a community to find. And the real James Hunt was beginning to understand that the line between those two identities might be thinner than he'd ever imagined. The denial letter crinkled in his pocket as he drove toward his next performance, carrying with it the weight of every real veteran who'd been turned away from the help they'd earned. The investigation was just beginning, but James already knew that whatever happened next, some part of him would never be quite the same. The denial letter crinkled in James's pocket as he pushed through the glass doors of the Phoenix Veterans Community Center. The building's lobby smelled like industrial coffee and floor wax, its walls lined with memorial plaques and faded photographs of local servicemen and women. A hand-lettered sign directed visitors to Support Group Meeting, Room 12B, All Veterans. Welcome. James had studied the building's layout during his preparation, but experiencing it felt different. The worn linoleum bore the scuff marks of countless wheelchairs and walkers. Bulletin boards overflowed with notices about job fairs, legal aid clinics, and suicide prevention hotlines. This wasn't the sterile efficiency of Pinnacle Insurance. This was a place that bore the honest wear of real human need. First time? The voice belonged to a woman in her early 40s, olive-skinned with intelligent dark eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She moved with the distinctive gait of someone compensating for a prosthetic leg, her movements efficient but slightly asymmetrical. Even without the small staff badge clipped to her flannel shirt, James would have recognized her as someone in charge. "Yes, ma'am." James extended his hand. "James Hunt. Friend of mine mentioned you folks might be able to help with some claim issues." Elena Rodriguez. Her handshake was firm, calloused from years of physical therapy and advocacy. "Work. Claims are certainly something we discuss here, among other things." Her eyes swept over James's wheelchair, his carefully groomed appearance, the quality of his clothing. "What branch?" "Army, 101st Airborne, 71 to 73. The lies came easily now, rehearsed until they felt like memory. "Vietnam." Something shifted in Elena's expression, not suspicion exactly, but a kind of professional assessment. "Tommy will want to meet you. He was 101st too, though a bit earlier. Medic." She led him down a hallway lined with more photographs. Faces young and old, some smiling in dress uniforms, others candid shots from overseas deployments. James found himself studying each face, wondering how many had struggled with claims, how many had been turned away by people like Derek Hoffman. Room 12B was set up in a circle with folding chairs and a few spaces left open for wheelchairs. About 15 people were already seated, ranging in age from their 20s to their 70s. The conversations were quiet, punctuated by the occasional laugh that carried the particular edge of people who'd learned to find humor in dark places. "Everyone!" Elena called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to managing groups. "We have a new member tonight. James, would you like to introduce yourself?" James maneuvered his wheelchair into the circle, feeling the weight of genuine eyes upon him. These weren't suspects or assets or sources of information. They were people who'd served their country and been failed by the systems meant to support them. The fictional backstory he'd memorized suddenly felt like a profound violation. "James Hunt," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Army, Vietnam era. Recently filed for disability benefits for PTSD and chronic pain." He paused, making eye contact around the circle. "Got denied this morning, actually." A collective murmur of understanding and sympathy rippled through the group. Several heads nodded with the grim recognition of shared experience. "Pinnacle. Insurance?" asked a weathered man in his 70s. His voice carrying the distinctive rasp of a long-time smoker. "Part of why I need the counseling." It was a good deflection, using the very symptoms of PTSD to explain gaps in his fictional military knowledge. Tommy nodded slowly, but James caught the slight narrowing of his eyes that suggested the older man wasn't entirely satisfied with the answer. Elena stood and moved to a whiteboard covered with case numbers and appeal deadlines. "The good news is that denial isn't the end of the road. We can help you file an appeal, and we've had some success. With media pressure, when the documentation is clearly sufficient." What kind of success rate?" James asked, genuinely curious about the advocacy process. "Honestly, about 30% on appeals, but that's 30% of people who might otherwise give up entirely." Eleanor's voice carried the weight of someone who'd fought too many losing battles. The system counts on veterans not having the resources or knowledge to fight back effectively. As the meeting continued, James found himself drawn into genuine conversation about the challenges of navigating veteran services, the bureaucratic maze of medical evaluations, and the emotional toll of having your service questioned by people who'd never worn a uniform. The discussion felt more real than any undercover operation he'd ever run, perhaps because the pain being shared was authentic, even if his own story wasn't. Miguel Santos approached him as the meeting wound down. "Mr. Hunt, would you mind if..." I asked you about something? Of course. It's just I've been having trouble sleeping, nightmares about my deployment. I keep thinking I should talk to someone, but I don't know if what I'm experiencing is bad enough to warrant benefits. Like other people had it worse, you know? James looked into the young man's earnest face and felt something crack inside his chest. This wasn't just about gathering intelligence anymore. Miguel was asking for help, for guidance, for the kind of mentorship that could make the difference between recovery and despair. Miguel, James said carefully, if you're struggling, that's enough. You don't have to compare your pain to anyone else's. You served, you're dealing with the aftermath, and you deserve help. The gratitude in Miguel's eyes was overwhelming. James realized with growing horror that his deception wasn't just about lying to potential criminals. It was about accepting trust and offering hope to people who desperately needed both. As the group dispersed, Elena approached his wheelchair. James, would you be interested in getting coffee sometime? I help people navigate the appeals process, and frankly, your case sounds like exactly the kind of systematic denial we might be able to challenge. James nodded, knowing that accepting Elena's help was crucial for his investigation. What he didn't expect was the way her offer felt less like an opportunity for intelligence gathering, and more like the first genuine human connection he'd made in months. I'd like that, he said, and meant it more than he should have. Walking, or, in his case, rolling, out of the community center, James felt the weight of Derek Hoffman's denial letter in his pocket. But he also carried something heavier, the growing realization that his fictional identity was becoming entangled with real emotions, real relationships, and real responsibility to people whose trust he was systematically betraying. The investigation was proceeding exactly as planned. The problem was that James Hunt, federal agent, was beginning to care more about the veterans he was deceiving than the case he was supposed to be building. The weight of Miguel's trusting eyes followed James as he drove through the Phoenix twilight toward his meeting with Sarah Kim. The Veteran Community Center's fluorescent lights faded in his rearview mirror, but the conversations from the support group echoed in his mind with uncomfortable clarity. Eleanor's offer of help, Tommy's probing questions, James Patterson's quiet dignity in the face of systematic betrayal, all of it felt more real than any undercover operation had a right to. The safe house was a nondescript ranch home in Ahwatukee, indistinguishable from the 1,000 others that sprawled across Phoenix's southern suburbs. James parked in the driveway and transferred from his modified van to his wheelchair, a routine that had become second nature over the past 3 months. Even here alone, he maintained his cover. The Bureau had learned long ago that the most dangerous moment for an undercover agent was when they thought they were safe. Sarah Kim answered the door before he could knock, her slight frame silhouetted against the warm light of the living room. At 38, she carried herself with the precise efficiency of someone who'd risen through bureau ranks by never making mistakes. Her black hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her dark suit bore the subtle wrinkles of someone who'd been working since dawn. "How did it go?" she asked without preamble, closing the door behind him and activating the electronic countermeasures that would prevent surveillance. "Denied. 12 minutes, just like we expected." James maneuvered his wheelchair into the living room, noting that Sarah had already spread case files across the coffee table. "Derek Hoffman is everything the intelligence suggested. Systematic, callous, and completely convinced he's smarter than everyone else." Sarah settled into the chair across from him, her expression unreadable. "Did you maintain cover?" "Perfectly. Though Tommy Williams asked some probing questions about my unit history. He's suspicious by nature, but I deflected without raising red flags." James paused, remembering the older veteran's sharp eyes. "He's not going to be easy to fool long-term." "We may not need long-term." Sarah's voice carried an edge of tension that James hadn't heard before. "There have been developments. Something cold settled in James's stomach. What kind of developments? Everything about him suggested military bearing worn soft by decades of civilian life. The straight posture, the careful grooming, the way his eyes assessed and catalogued without seeming to stare. That's right, Derek Hoffman. The man's expression darkened. Tommy Williams. Most folks call me Doc. He leaned forward slightly, his pale blue eyes sharp with intelligence. Derek Hoffman's been denying claims for 5 years running, systematic as clockwork. What reason did he give? Insufficient evidence, said my medical records didn't establish service connection. James pulled out the denial letter, noting how the paper felt heavier in this room full of people who understood its true weight. Standard response, Elena said bitterly. Same thing they told Patterson here. She gestured toward a quiet man in his 30s sitting across the circle. Iraq veteran, TBI and PTSD from an IED blast. 3 separate medical evaluations confirming service connection, and Hoffman still denied his claim. James Patterson looked up at the mention of his name, his movements slightly delayed in the way that suggested brain injury. 6 months I waited, he said quietly. Lost my apartment, my job, ended up on the streets until Elena's group found me. The real weight of the investigation hit James like a physical blow. This wasn't an abstract case about insurance fraud. It was about real people whose lives had been destroyed by systematic cruelty. James Patterson, the man whose denied claim had sparked this entire federal operation, sat 3 feet away from him, still struggling with the aftermath of institutional betrayal. The system's broken, said a young woman with short, cropped hair and the kind of hyper-vigilant posture that suggested recent combat experience. They make it so hard to get help that most people just give up. That's the point, Elena said. Denial first, ask questions never. It's not about determining legitimate claims, it's about protecting profit margins. A younger man James recognized from his file photos raised his hand tentatively. Miguel Santos, Afghanistan veteran struggling with survivor's guilt and the transition to civilian life. James, Mr. Hunt, how are you handling it? The denial, I mean. I've been thinking about filing a claim myself, but hearing stories like this. James felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. This young man was looking to him for guidance, for hope, for the kind of mentorship that one veteran could provide another. The fictional James Hunt was supposed to be a source of wisdom and encouragement. The real James Hunt felt like a fraud, sitting among people whose pain was genuine and whose trust was precious. It hurts, he said finally, surprised by the honesty in his own voice. Feels like being told your service doesn't matter, that your pain isn't real. He looked around the circle, meeting each pair of eyes. But being here, listening to all of you, it helps to know I'm not alone. Tommy Williams studied James with the intensity of someone who'd spent decades reading People in Crisis. You mentioned you were 101st. What unit specifically? James felt his pulse quicken slightly, but his preparation held. 2nd Brigade, 502nd Infantry, Firebase Charlie mostly. Tommy's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Charlie was a rough posting, lost a lot of good people there. He paused, his gaze never leaving James's face. You remember Captain Morrison? Big guy from Texas, always. Talking about his wife's barbecue? The question hung in the air like smoke. James felt the attention of the entire circle focusing on him, though he doubted anyone else understood the significance of the moment. Tommy was testing him, probing for inconsistencies in his cover story. A real veteran would either remember Morrison or know enough about unit structure to deflect the question naturally. Morrison! James let his expression grow distant, as if accessing difficult memories. Can't say the name rings a bell, but there were a lot of officers rotating through. Memory gets fuzzy sometimes. Deal. Sarah reached for a manila folder marked with classification stamps. Agent Collins has been asking questions about our operation. Casual inquiries, but persistent. He wanted to know about resource allocation for veteran-related cases, whether we were running any active investigations in the insurance sector. Collins. The name triggered memories of case briefings and personnel files. DEA liaison, 20-year veteran of federal service, impeccable record on paper. Also, according to financial intelligence, a man with serious gambling debts and increasingly desperate need for additional income. How much does he know? James asked. That's what worries me. His questions were too specific to be coincidental. Sarah opened the folder, revealing surveillance photos and financial records. We've been monitoring his communications and bank accounts. There's been unusual activity, cash deposits that don't match his salary, encrypted phone calls to unknown numbers. James studied the photographs, noting the timestamps and locations. Collins, meeting with unidentified individuals in parking lots, restaurants, places where surveillance would be difficult. The pattern was classic. A federal agent selling information to the highest bidder. You think he's feeding information to Pinnacle. I think he's feeding information to whoever pays him. Sarah's voice was grim. The question is, how much? He knows about you specifically. The implications hit James like a physical blow. If Collins was compromised, if he'd identified James as an undercover federal agent, then the entire operation was blown. Worse, James's safety was compromised, and everyone he'd met at the Veteran Community Center could be at risk. What's the timeline on shutting this down? James asked. Sarah hesitated, and that pause told James everything he needed to know. That's the other development. Deputy Director Morrison wants results fast. There's political pressure from the Veterans Affairs Committee, media attention building around veteran claim denials. They want us to move to the arrest phase within 2 weeks. 2 weeks! James felt his carefully constructed operation crumbling. Sarah, I've barely established myself in the community. Elena Rodriguez offered to help with my appeal. That's our way into the advocacy network, our chance to understand the full scope of the fraud. We need months, not weeks. I know. Sarah's expression was pained. But Morrison's concerned about exposure, especially with Collins asking questions. He'd rather get a solid case against Derek Hoffman than risk losing everything chasing a larger conspiracy. James leaned back in his wheelchair, his mind racing through the implications. 2 weeks wasn't enough time to build the comprehensive case he'd envisioned. It certainly wasn't enough time to help the veterans he'd met tonight, people like Miguel Santos, who were just beginning to trust him, or James Patterson, who deserved to see the system that had failed him finally held accountable. There's something else, Sarah continued, her voice carefully neutral. Morrison wants to discuss the psychological evaluations. What psychological evaluations? Standard protocol for extended undercover operations. Dr. Reyes has been reviewing your reports, and she's concerned about emotional investment in your targets. James felt heat rise in his chest. They're not targets, Sarah. They're victims, real people whose lives have been destroyed by systematic fraud. See, that's exactly what concerns her. Sarah's tone remained professional, but James caught the worry in her eyes. James, you're referring to your cover identities community as real people. You're emotionally invested in outcomes that should be secondary to the investigation. Secondary? James's voice rose despite his efforts to stay calm. A man named James Patterson is homeless because Derek Hoffman denied his legitimate claim. Miguel Santos is struggling with PTSD and looking to me for guidance. Elena Rodriguez is offering to help me navigate a system designed to crush people like her. How is any of that secondary? Sarah leaned forward, her expression intense. Because you're not really James Hunt, disabled Vietnam veteran. You're Special Agent James Hunt, and your job is to gather evidence of insurance fraud, not to solve every veteran's problems. The words hit harder than Sarah had probably intended. James stared at her for a long moment, feeling the weight of his double life pressing down like a physical burden. She was right, of course. He was a federal agent running an undercover operation, not a veteran seeking help. But the distinction felt increasingly meaningless when faced with real human suffering. "The line's getting blurred," he admitted quietly. "I know. That's why Dr. Reyes wants to see you, and why Morrison's pushing for rapid resolution." Sarah's voice softened slightly. "James, you're one of the best undercover agents I've ever worked with, but this case is different. You're not infiltrating a crime family or a terrorist cell. You're embedding yourself in a community of people who've been betrayed by every institution they've ever trusted. Of course, you're going to empathize with them." James nodded, understanding the psychology, even as he resented the implication that his growing care for the veteran community was a professional liability. What about Collins? If he's feeding information to Derek Hoffman, moving fast might be our only option anyway. Exactly. Sarah pulled out another file, this one containing surveillance reports and communication intercepts. "We've identified unusual patterns in Collins's behavior over the past month. Phone calls to numbers registered to shell companies, meetings with individuals we can't identify, cash transactions that suggest payment for services." James studied the reports, noting the dates and times. Some of the activity correlated with key moments in his investigation: his initial contact with the veteran community, his first visit to Pinnacle Insurance, his attendance at the support group meeting. "He's been tracking my movements," James realized. "We think so, which means Derek Hoffman may already know more about you than he's letting on." Sarah's expression was grim. "That's why Morrison wants to accelerate the timeline. If Collins has compromised your identity, we need to move before they have time to destroy evidence or relocate assets." The strategic logic was sound, but James felt a growing sense of panic at the thought of abandoning his new connection so quickly. Elena's offer to help with his appeal wasn't just an intelligence. Preparing and narrating this story took a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Opportunity, it was a chance to understand how the advocacy community worked, to identify other victims, to build a case that could bring real justice rather than just a headline. "What if I refuse the accelerated timeline?" James asked. Sarah's expression became carefully neutral. "That's not really an option. Morrison's made it clear that this is a directive, not a suggestion." "And if I push back?" "Then you'll be pulled from the operation and replaced with someone more willing to follow orders." Sarah's voice carried genuine regret. "James, I know this isn't what you wanted to hear, but we have to protect the integrity of the investigation, even if it means sacrificing some of the broader objectives." James sat in silence for a long moment, weighing his options. He could follow orders, accelerate the investigation, and probably build a solid case against Derek Hoffman. Or he could push back, risk his career, and potentially lose the chance to help any of the veterans he'd met. Neither option felt adequate to the moral weight of what he'd witnessed. "There's a third choice," he said finally. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" "Elena Rodriguez offered to help me navigate the appeals process. What if I accept her help and use it to gather intelligence about the broader fraud network? If Collins is feeding information to Derek, then Derek might make mistakes trying to stay ahead of us. We could use that to our advantage." "That's incredibly risky. If your cover is blown, then at least we'll have tried to build a comprehensive case instead of settling for whatever we can grab in 2 weeks." James met Sarah's eyes steadily. These people deserve better than a rushed investigation that catches one middle manager while the system continues to crush veterans. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her expression cycling between professional concern and genuine sympathy. You know Morrison will never approve that approach. Then maybe Morrison doesn't need to know the details. The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that both agents understood perfectly. Sarah was being asked to choose between following orders and supporting what she knew was right. James was asking her to risk her career for an investigation that had become more personal than professional. "Elena Rodriguez," Sarah said finally. "When are you supposed to meet with her?" "We didn't set a specific time. She said to call when I was ready to start the appeals process." Sarah nodded slowly, her expression suggesting she was making a decision that would define both of their careers. "Call her tomorrow. Set up a meeting. We'll see what kind of intelligence you can gather about the advocacy network and how they're dealing with systematic denials. And Morrison? I'll handle Morrison. Buy us some time to see what develops." Sarah's smile was tight but genuine. "Just be careful, James. These people trust you, and that makes this whole operation more dangerous than either of us anticipated." As James prepared to leave, he felt the weight of tomorrow's deception settling on his shoulders. He was going to call Elena Rodriguez, accept her help, and use her trust to gather intelligence about the very community that had welcomed him. The moral complexity of it made his chest tight. But the alternative, abandoning the investigation and leaving people like Miguel Santos and James Patterson to navigate a broken system alone, felt even worse. The line between James Hunt the agent and James Hunt the veteran was blurring beyond recognition. Tomorrow he would have to decide which identity mattered more. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Veteran Advocacy Center's parking lot as James arrived for his meeting with Elena Rodriguez. Sarah's warning about Collins and the accelerated timeline echoed in his mind, but he pushed the concerns aside, focusing on the role he needed to play. Today, James Hunt the veteran would accept help from someone whose trust he was systematically betraying. Eleanor was waiting by the center's entrance, her dark hair catching the light as she gestured animatedly into her phone. "Told him at times that the medical records were complete, but he keeps claiming there's missing documentation. It's the same runaround they give everyone." She noticed James approaching and held up a finger. "I have to go, Mrs. Chen, but call me if you need anything else." "Work never stops?" James asked as she ended the call. "Never." Elena's smile was tired but genuine. "Veteran's wife, whose husband's claim has been pending for 8 months. Same insurance company, same agent who denied yours." Her expression darkened. "Derek Hoffman seems to specialize in making people's lives miserable." They made their way inside, Elena leading him to a small office crowded with filing cabinets and bulletin boards covered in case tracking sheets. The walls were lined with thank you letters from veterans, photos from advocacy events, and copies of successful appeal decisions. It felt like a war room in the fight against institutional indifference. "Coffee?" Elena gestured toward a machine that looked marginally more functional than the one at Pinnacle Insurance. "Please." James positioned his wheelchair beside her desk, noting the careful organization of files, the color-coded tracking system, the evidence of someone fighting a systematic battle with systematic methods. "This is impressive. How long have you been doing advocacy work?" "Since my own claim got denied in 2018. Elena handed him a steaming mug, her fingers briefly brushing his. "Army medic, lost my leg to an IED outside Kandahar. Came home to find out the Pinnacle Insurance had decided my amputation wasn't service-connected because I'd had a childhood injury to the same leg." James felt his chest tighten with genuine anger. "That's insane." "That's Derek Hoffman, Elena settled into her chair, her expression growing distant. Took me 2 years and 3 appeals to get my benefits. By then, I'd learned enough about the system to help other people navigate it. Started volunteering here, eventually got hired full-time. As she spoke, James found himself studying her face, noting the way her eyes hardened when she talked. About the denial process, the protective set of her shoulders when she mentioned helping other veterans. This wasn't just professional advocacy, it was personal mission, born from her own experience with institutional betrayal. So, Elena pulled out a thick file folder. Let's talk about your appeals strategy. I've seen Derek Hoffman deny claims. For everything from missing signatures to incorrect font sizes, he's creative in his cruelty, but he's also predictable. She spread James's fabricated medical records across her desk, her movements efficient and practiced. James watched her work, noting how she approached each document with the intensity of someone who understood that details could mean the difference between housing and homelessness for the people she helped. Your psychological evaluation from Dr. Martinez is comprehensive, Elena said, flipping through pages of fictional trauma assessments. Good documentation of symptom onset, clear connection to combat experiences. The problem is that Hoffman has a pattern of dismissing Dr. Martinez's evaluations specifically. Why Dr. Martinez? Because she's thorough. She actually listens to veterans, takes time to understand their experiences, documents everything properly. Eleanor's voice carried bitter irony. In other words, she does her job too well for Hoffman's comfort. James leaned forward, his investigative instincts engaging despite the personal complexity of the situation. You're saying he targets specific medical professionals? Absolutely. We've tracked patterns over the past 3 years. Dr. Martinez, Dr. Patel, Dr. Williams, any mental health professional who consistently finds service-connected conditions gets their evaluations scrutinized more heavily. Meanwhile, doctors who find minimal impairment rarely get questioned. The implications were staggering. Derek Hoffman wasn't just denying individual claims, he was systematically undermining medical professionals who advocated for veterans. It was a level of corruption that went far beyond simple greed into active malice. How do you prove something like that? James asked. Elena's smile was sharp. Very carefully, and with lots of documentation. She pulled out a thick binder, filled with spreadsheets and case summaries. Every denial we've seen, every pattern we've identified, every suspicious decision gets logged and analyzed. We've been building a database for 2 years. James stared at the binder, realizing that Elena and her advocacy network had been conducting their own investigation into Pinnacle Insurance's practices. They'd identified the same patterns that had prompted federal attention, but they'd done it from the ground up, case by case, veteran by veteran. This is incredible work, he said, meaning it completely. It's also completely useless in court, Elena replied bitterly. Hoffman's smart enough to create plausible justifications for every denial. Insufficient documentation, inconsistent testimony, lack of service connection. He follows the letter of the law while completely ignoring its spirit. A knock on the office door interrupted their conversation. Elena? Sorry to bother you, but there's someone here to see you. James turned to see a young woman in a conservative business suit standing in the doorway. She was perhaps late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a professional style, and eyes that carried the kind of nervous energy that suggested she was operating outside her comfort zone. Can I help you? Elena's voice was polite but cautious. I hope so. My name is Rebecca Hoffman. I work at Pinnacle Insurance. She paused, glancing between Elena and James. I think there might be some problems with how we're processing veteran claims. The silence that followed was electric. James felt his pulse quicken as he recognized Derek Hoffman's daughter from the office yesterday. Elena's expression cycled through surprise, suspicion, and cautious interest. Problems? Elena's voice was carefully neutral. Rebecca stepped into the office, closing the door behind her. "I've been reviewing claim files, and I'm seeing patterns that don't make sense. Legitimate claims being denied for questionable reasons, medical evaluations being dismissed without proper review." She looked directly at James. "Including yours, Mr. Hunt." James felt the careful balance of his investigation shifting. Rebecca Hoffman showing up here wasn't part of any plan. It was either a massive coincidence or evidence that Derek had discovered his true identity and was using his daughter to test him. "Why come to us?" Elena asked. "If you're concerned about company practices, shouldn't you talk to your supervisors?" Rebecca's laugh was bitter. "My supervisor is my father, and he's the source of the problem." She sat down heavily in the spare chair, her professional composure cracking slightly. "I took this job because I wanted to help people. Instead, I'm watching him destroy lives. For profit." Elena and James exchanged glances. If Rebecca was genuine, she represented an unprecedented opportunity to gather inside information about Pinnacle's operations. If she was playing some kind of game for her father, she was extremely dangerous. "What kind of patterns are you seeing?" Elena asked carefully. Rebecca pulled out a manila folder. "Systematic targeting of specific medical professionals. Denial rates that vary dramatically based on the evaluating physician rather than the severity of conditions. Claims being processed in minutes rather than the hours required for proper review." She paused. "And communication with external contacts that seems designed to tip them off about potential problem cases." James felt his blood freeze. External contacts. If Rebecca was telling the truth, she might have evidence of Derek's connection to Agent Collins. "What kind of external contacts?" James asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Phone calls to numbers that aren't in our company directory. Emails to addresses that don't match any of our partner organizations." Rebecca's expression was troubled. "I think my father might be selling information about veteran claims to interested parties." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Rebecca wasn't Hoffman just offering intelligence about claim denials. She was describing evidence of federal crimes, conspiracy, and systematic fraud that went far beyond anything James had anticipated. Elena leaned forward, her advocacy instincts overriding her caution. "Rebecca, what you're describing could help hundreds of veterans get the benefits they deserve, but it's also incredibly dangerous for you, personally." "I know." Rebecca's voice was quiet but determined. "I've been thinking about this for months, watching good people get turned away, seeing legitimate claims denied for ridiculous reasons. I can't be part of it anymore." James studied Rebecca's face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. What he saw was genuine distress, moral conflict, and the kind of nervous determination that suggested someone making a difficult, ethical choice. Either she was an extremely skilled actress, or Derek Hoffman's daughter was about to become his most valuable asset. "What do you need from us?" Elena asked. "Help, guidance, someone who understands the system well enough to know what evidence would actually matter." Rebecca looked between them, "and maybe protection, if my father finds out what I'm doing." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood that betraying Derek Hoffman could have consequences far beyond losing a job. Elena reached across her desk and placed her hand on Rebecca's. "We'll help you, but we need to be smart about this. Systematic fraud cases require careful documentation, and we can't afford to make mistakes." James nodded, his mind already racing through the implications for his investigation. Rebecca Hoffman represented everything Sarah had warned him about, an unexpected development that could either accelerate the case or destroy it completely. But she also represented hope for the veterans he'd met, people like Miguel Santos and James Patterson, who deserved better than a system designed to crush them. "There's something else," Rebecca said quietly. My father has been acting strangely lately, paranoid, secretive. He's been making phone calls from his car instead of his office, staying late to work on files he won't let anyone else see." She paused. "I think he knows something's coming." The weight of Colin's betrayal settled over James like a shroud. If Derek Hoffman was aware of federal attention, then the investigation was already compromised. But Rebecca's willingness to cooperate might represent the only chance to salvage something meaningful from the operation. As Elena began discussing next steps with Rebecca, James felt the familiar vertigo of an undercover operation spiraling beyond anyone's control. He was sitting in a room with two women who trusted him completely, planning to use their trust to build a case that could destroy one of their fathers while saving the other's life's work. The line between justice and deception had never felt thinner. The pre-dawn darkness of Phoenix felt heavy with anticipation as federal agents surrounded Pinnacle Insurance. James watched from the surveillance van's monitors as tactical teams moved into position, their coordinated movements visible through infrared cameras. Sarah's voice crackled through his earpiece, calm and professional despite the operation's accelerated timeline. "All teams in position, target building secured, moving to entry in 60 seconds. James gripped his wheelchair's armrests, feeling the weight of months of undercover work culminating in this moment. Somewhere inside that building lay evidence of systematic fraud that had destroyed countless veterans' lives. But the victory felt hollow, tainted by Collins's betrayal and the knowledge that Derek Hoffman had likely spent the last 24 hours destroying crucial documentation. Breach, breach, breach. The monitors lit up with thermal signatures as agents flooded into Pinnacle Insurance through multiple entry points. James could make out individual figures moving through corridors he'd memorized during his visits, their precise movements a stark contrast to his careful, vulnerable navigation as a disabled veteran seeking help. "Primary target's office is empty," came the report from Team Alpha. "Computer terminal is active, but we're seeing evidence of recent file deletion." Sarah cursed under her breath. "He's been here recently. Check for any physical files, backup drives, anything that might contain claim records." James watched the systematic search unfold, noting how the agents moved through spaces that had felt so different during his undercover visits. Derek Hoffman's office, where he'd experienced the casual cruelty of institutional betrayal, now swarmed, with federal investigators documenting evidence of criminal fraud. "We've got something," Team Bravo reported from the main office area. "File cabinets full of claim records, but they appear to be selectively purged. Missing files correspond to cases flagged in our investigation." The pattern was clear. Derek had known exactly which cases to target for destruction, suggesting Collins had provided detailed intelligence about the federal investigation's scope. Years of systematic fraud were being erased with surgical precision. "Sir," one of the agents addressed Sarah through the comm system, "we found Rebecca Hoffman in the employee break room. She appears to be unharmed, but claims she's been here all night reviewing files." James felt a mixture of relief and suspicion. Rebecca's presence at the scene could mean she was genuinely trying to preserve evidence, or that she was part of an elaborate deception orchestrated by her father. "Bring her to the van for preliminary questioning," Sarah ordered, "and secure any files she was working with." 20 minutes later, Rebecca Hoffman sat across from James and Sarah in the surveillance van's cramped interview space. Her professional demeanor from yesterday had been replaced by exhaustion and nervous energy, her hair disheveled and her business suit wrinkled from spending the night in an office building. "Ms. Hoffman," Sarah began, her tone carefully neutral, "can you explain why you were in the building during our raid?" Rebecca's eyes moved between Sarah and James, her expression cycling through confusion and growing realization. "You're federal agents," she said quietly. "The investigation I suspected, it's real. Answer the question, Sarah pressed. I've been copying files for the past 6 hours, Rebecca said, her voice gaining strength. My father came in around 8 p.m. last night, agitated and paranoid. He started destroying documents, deleting computer files, making phone calls to people he wouldn't identify. She paused, looking directly at James. He mentioned your name specifically, Mr. Hunt. Said you were more than you appeared to be. James felt his stomach drop. Derek's suspicions had been confirmed, probably through Collins's intelligence, which meant the entire veteran community now knew they'd been infiltrated by a federal agent. What files did you copy? Sarah asked. Rebecca reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers and several USB drives. Claim records going back 3 years, communication logs, email correspondence with external contacts. Her voice was steady now, committed. Everything I could save before he destroyed it. Sarah accepted the materials with professional calm, but James could see the relief in her eyes. If Rebecca's evidence was legitimate, it could salvage the investigation despite Collins's betrayal and Derek's evidence destruction. There's something else, Rebecca continued. My father received a call around midnight from someone he called Collins. They discussed containing the exposure and eliminating witnesses. I recorded the conversation. She handed Sarah a small digital recorder, its implications staggering. If Derek and Collins had discussed witness elimination, it elevated the charges from fraud to conspiracy and potentially attempted murder. Ms. Hoffman, Sarah said carefully, where is your father now? I don't know. He left around 2 a.m. with several boxes of files and his laptop. Said he had clean-up to handle before the federal raids began. Rebecca's expression was troubled. He seemed to know exactly when you were coming. The confirmation of Collins's betrayal hung heavy in the van's confined space. James realized that every detail of the investigation, timeline, targets, operational planning, had been compromised from the beginning. Derek Hoffman hadn't just been covering his tracks. He'd been staying one step ahead of federal law enforcement through inside information. Agent Hunt, Rebecca said, turning to face James directly. The veterans at the community center they know who you really are? The question James had been dreading finally arrived. He looked into Rebecca's eyes and saw genuine concern for people she'd never met, worry about a community that had welcomed a federal agent as one of their own. Not yet, James admitted quietly. They will soon, Rebecca said. My father was making calls to community leaders, claiming there was a federal infiltrator trying to entrap veterans into making false statements. Her voice carried deep regret. He's trying to turn the community against you before the truth about his fraud comes out. James felt the carefully constructed relationships of the past months crumbling in real time. Elena Rodriguez, who'd offered to help with his appeal. Tommy Williams, who'd shared stories of Vietnam with someone he thought was a fellow veteran. Miguel Santos, who'd looked to him for mentorship and guidance. All of them would wake up this morning to learn that their trust had been systematically betrayed. Sir, an agent's voice crackled through the comm system, we have a situation at the Phoenix Veterans Community Center. Large crowd gathering, appears to be some kind of emergency meeting. Sarah and James exchanged glances, both understanding the implications. Derek's preemptive strike was working, turning the veteran community against the federal investigation before they could understand its true purpose. We need to get out there, James said. If Derek's poisoning the community against the investigation, we'll lose any chance of helping the veterans who were actually harmed by his fraud. Absolutely not, Sarah replied firmly. Your cover is blown, which means showing up at the Veterans Center could trigger a riot. These people feel betrayed, and seeing you in person will only make it worse. James understood the tactical logic. But the thought of Elena Rodriguez and the others learning about his deception through Derek Hoffman's manipulative narrative felt unbearable. They deserved to hear the truth from him, to understand that his infiltration had been motivated by genuine desire to expose the fraud that was destroying their lives. "There has to be another way," James said. Rebecca looked between the two. "Agents," her expression thoughtful. "Maybe there is. The veterans don't know me well, but they know I work at Pinnacle Insurance. If I went to the community center and explained what my father has been doing, showed them the evidence I copied." You'd be putting yourself at serious risk," Sarah warned. "If your father is eliminating witnesses, publicly exposing his crimes makes you a target." "I'm already a target," Rebecca replied with quiet determination. "But those veterans deserve to know the truth about why their claims were denied, and they deserve to hear it from someone who witnessed the fraud firsthand." James studied Rebecca's face, seeing echoes of the moral courage that had driven his own decision to become a federal agent. She was choosing to risk everything to protect people she barely knew, people her father had systematically victimized. "Rebecca," James said quietly, "if you do this, there's no going back. Your relationship with your father, your job, your entire life, it all changes." "My life changed the moment I realized what he was doing to veterans," Rebecca replied. "The only question now is whether I'm going to be part of the solution or part of the cover-up." Sarah was already coordinating protective surveillance for Rebecca's trip to the Veteran Center. "We'll have agents positioned around the building, but we can't intervene directly without compromising the community's trust even further." As Rebecca prepared to face a room full of angry, betrayed veterans, James felt the weight of his choices settling on his shoulders. His undercover operation had succeeded in gathering evidence and exposing fraud, but the human cost was becoming clear. The community that had welcomed him was now shattered by betrayal, and the people who'd trusted him would have to rebuild that trust from scratch. The line between justice and deception had finally snapped, leaving everyone to navigate the wreckage of good intentions and necessary lies. The Phoenix Veterans Community Center had never felt more like a battleground than it did at 9 a.m. that morning. James watched through binoculars from a surveillance van positioned 3 blocks away as veterans streamed into the building, their faces reflecting a mixture of anger, confusion, and betrayal. Word of the federal raid and Derek Hoffman's claims about an infiltrator had spread through the tight-knit community like wildfire. "Crowd estimate is approaching 80 people," Sarah reported through her earpiece. "That's more than any support group meeting on record." James adjusted his position in the van, his wheelchair locked in place as he maintained visual surveillance of the building he'd entered so many times as a fellow veteran seeking help. Now he was watching from the outside, a federal agent whose deception had shattered the trust of people who'd already been betrayed by too many institutions. Rebecca Hoffman's small Honda pulled into the parking lot, her movements hesitant as she surveyed the crowd of veterans gathering near the entrance. Several men James recognized from support group meetings were engaged in heated conversations, their body language suggesting anger and defensive positioning. "She's having second thoughts," Sarah observed. "Can you blame her?" James replied, noting how some of the veterans had turned to watch Rebecca's approach. "She's about to walk into a room full of people whose lives her father helped destroy." Through the binoculars, James could see Elena Rodriguez standing near the community center's entrance, her prosthetic leg visible beneath rolled-up jeans as she gestured animatedly to Tommy Williams. Even from this distance, James could read the tension in Elena's posture, the protective stance she adopted when the veteran community faced external threats. Rebecca emerged from her car, carrying a banker's box full of documents, the evidence she'd preserved during the night of Derek's destruction spree. Several veterans approached her immediately, their expressions ranging from suspicious to openly hostile. "This could go bad quickly," Sarah muttered, her hand moving toward her radio. "Wait," James said, watching Elena Rodriguez break away from her conversation with Tommy and approach the growing confrontation. "Elena's going to handle it." Through the binoculars, James watched Elena step between Rebecca and the most agitated veterans, her hands raised in a calming gesture. He couldn't hear the conversation, but Elena's body language suggested she was urging restraint, asking for a chance to hear what Rebecca had to say. Tommy Williams joined the group, his weathered face serious as he examined Rebecca's credentials and the box of documents she carried. After a brief discussion, the crowd began moving toward the community center's main meeting room. "They're going inside," James reported. "Elena's given Rebecca a chance to speak." "Good," Sarah replied, though her tone suggested she understood the risks involved. Rebecca's testimony could be crucial for rebuilding trust with the veteran community. James lowered his binoculars, feeling the weight of being an observer rather than a participant in this crucial moment. For months, he'd been part of this community's conversations, had shared in their struggles and victories. Now he was relegated to watching from a distance as they processed the betrayal his investigation had created. "Agent Hunt," a voice crackled through his earpiece. "We're monitoring emergency services radio. Ambulance requested at the Veterans Center. Possible medical emergency." James's blood froze. What kind of medical emergency? "Unknown. EMS is en route." Through the binoculars, James could see people rushing out of the community center, their movements suggesting panic rather than the orderly evacuation of a planned meeting. Several veterans were supporting someone who appeared to be in distress. "That's Miguel Santos," James identified, recognizing the young Afghanistan veteran who'd looked to him for mentorship. "He's having some kind of episode." Sarah was already coordinating with local emergency services. "EMS is 2 minutes out. Do we have visual on the cause of distress?" James watched as Elena Rodriguez knelt beside Miguel, her combat medic training evident in her calm, professional assessment of his condition. Tommy Williams was clearing space around them while other veterans formed a protective circle, their earlier anger replaced by immediate concern for one of their own. "It looks like a panic attack," James observed, "probably triggered by stress from learning about the investigation." The irony was devastating. Miguel Santos, who'd sought James's guidance about filing his own disability claim, was now suffering a psychological crisis because he'd learned that his mentor was a federal agent who'd been lying to him from their first conversation. Rebecca Hoffman emerged from the building, her face pale as she spoke urgently with Elena Rodriguez. James could see her gesturing toward the box of documents, apparently trying to explain their significance even as the medical emergency unfolded. Around them, the ambulance arrived with sirens blaring, its paramedics quickly taking over Miguel's care from Elena. James watched as they checked his vitals and administered what appeared to be a mild sedative to calm his panic response. "He's stable," Sarah reported, monitoring emergency radio traffic. "Paramedics are recommending transport for evaluation, but he's conscious and responsive." James felt a mixture of relief and crushing guilt. Miguel's panic attack was a direct result of the investigation's exposure, a casualty of the deception necessary to expose Derek Hoffman's fraud. The young veteran who'd trusted James completely was now experiencing psychological trauma because that trust had been systematically betrayed. As the ambulance departed, the crowd of veterans began to disperse, their conversations animated and intense. Rebecca Hoffman remained near the entrance with Elena Rodriguez and Tommy Williams, the three of them engaged in what appeared to be serious discussion about the documents she'd brought. "Rebecca's still talking to them," James observed. "Elena and Tommy seem to be listening. That's encouraging. If the community leadership accepts Rebecca's evidence, it could help them understand that the investigation was targeting fraud, not veterans." James adjusted his binoculars to focus on Eleanor's face, noting the careful attention she was paying to Rebecca's explanations. Eleanor's expression cycled between anger, understanding, and what might have been sympathy for the young woman who'd risked everything to expose her father's crimes. Tommy Williams examined documents from Rebecca's box, his weathered features serious as he processed the evidence of systematic fraud. Several other veterans gathered around them, creating an impromptu leadership council to evaluate the information Rebecca had preserved. "They're organizing some kind of response," James reported. "Looks like Elena and Tommy are coordinating with Rebecca to review the evidence systematically." After 20 minutes of intense discussion, the group began, moving back toward the community center's entrance. Elena Rodriguez paused at the doorway, her eyes scanning the parking lot and surrounding area with the practiced awareness of someone who'd served in combat zones. For a moment, James had the irrational fear that Elena's gaze would somehow penetrate the surveillance van's tinted windows, that she would see him watching from a distance and understand the depth of his betrayal. But she turned and followed the others inside, leaving James to contemplate the growing distance between his federal agent identity and the community that had welcomed him. "They're going back inside," Sarah observed, "probably to review Rebecca's documents in detail." "Elena's smart," James said quietly. "She'll want to verify everything before making any decisions about how the community responds to the investigation. And if the evidence supports Rebecca's claims about her father's fraud." James was quiet for a long moment, watching the empty parking lot where he'd arrived so many times as a fellow veteran seeking help and community. "Then they'll have to decide whether the investigation's goals justify the methods we use to achieve them." The weight of that decision, and its implications for his relationship with people who'd trusted him, settled over James like a shroud. The community would judge not just Derek Hoffman's crimes, but James's deception, weighing the value of justice against the cost of betrayal. And James would have to live with whatever verdict they reached, knowing that his success as a federal agent had come at the price of relationships that had meant more to him than any case file could capture. As the surveillance van prepared to relocate to avoid detection, James took one last look at the community center that had become a second home during his months undercover. Whatever happened next, he knew that the James Hunt who emerged from this investigation would be fundamentally different from the agent who'd begun it. The line between duty and humanity had been crossed so many times that finding his way back felt impossible. The secure conference room at the Phoenix FBI field office buzzed with the controlled chaos of a major investigation expanding beyond its original scope. James watched from his wheelchair as agents pinned surveillance photos, financial records, and communication intercepts to the walls, creating a visual map of corruption that stretched far beyond Derek Hoffman's insurance fraud. Sarah Kim stood at the head of the table, her expression grim as she briefed the expanded task force. Collins's arrest this morning revealed communications with at least 6 insurance companies, 4 federal agencies, and multiple private investigators. What we thought was isolated fraud at Pinnacle Insurance is actually a coordinated network. James studied the organizational chart taking shape on the whiteboard, names connected by red lines indicating financial relationships, communication patterns, and shared criminal objectives. Derek Hoffman's position near the center of the web surprised no one, but the scope of his connections was staggering. "How long has this been operating?" asked Agent Martinez from the White-Collar Crime Division. "Financial analysis suggests at least 5 years of coordinated activity," Sarah replied, pulling up bank records on the main display. Collins's gambling debt started mounting in 2019, which corresponds with the first unusual cash deposits in his accounts. Derek Hoffman's lifestyle improvements follow a similar timeline. James leaned forward, studying the financial patterns. 5 years of systematic fraud targeting veterans. How many claims are we talking about? Preliminary estimates suggest over 1,500 denied claims across the network, Sarah answered. Total financial impact to veterans and their families could exceed $50 million in denied benefits. The number hit James like a physical blow. 1,500 veterans whose legitimate claims had been denied to protect insurance company profit margins. 1,500 families thrust into financial crisis, medical bankruptcy, homelessness, despair. The magnitude of suffering caused by this conspiracy dwarfed anything he'd imagined during his undercover investigation. Agent Williams from Financial Crimes raised his hand. What about Victoria Sterling, Pinnacle's executive who's been dodging our interview requests? Sarah clicked to a new slide showing communication records and travel patterns. Sterling's phone records show regular contact with Collins and Derek Hoffman, but the conversations were encrypted. Her travel schedule includes meetings with executives from other insurance companies in the network. Whether she's a co-conspirator or a high-level target is still unclear. She's too smart to leave obvious evidence, James said, remembering his brief encounters with Victoria Sterling during his visits to Pinnacle Insurance. But her position in the company hierarchy means she either knew about the systematic denials or was criminally negligent in her oversight duties. The conference room door opened to admit Deputy Director Morrison, his presence immediately shifting the room's energy toward formal briefing mode. At 62, Morrison carried himself with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades navigating federal bureaucracy and political pressure. "Status report," Morrison said without preamble, taking his seat at the head of the table. Sarah began a concise summary of the investigation's expansion, but Morrison interrupted after 2 minutes. "I'm more interested in damage control than case expansion," Morrison said, his tone carrying implications that made several agents shift uncomfortably. "Congressional oversight is breathing down our necks about Collins's betrayal. The Veterans Affairs Committee wants answers about how a federal agent compromised an investigation targeting veteran fraud." James felt the familiar tension of political considerations overriding investigative priorities. "Sir, the evidence Rebecca Hoffman preserved shows this conspiracy extends across multiple federal agencies. Limiting our investigation to protect political relationships means leaving criminals in positions to continue victimizing veterans." Morrison's gaze fixed on James with uncomfortable intensity. "Agent Hunt, your undercover operation was successful in identifying Derek Hoffman's fraud, but Collins's betrayal has created complications that extend beyond criminal prosecution to national security concerns." "National security?" James couldn't hide his confusion. Collins had access to classified information about federal investigations targeting defense contractors, homeland security initiatives, and counterintelligence operations, Morrison explained. If he was selling information to criminal networks for 5 years, we have to assume that classified material was compromised. The implications settled over the room like a toxic cloud. Collins's betrayal wasn't just about insurance fraud. It potentially compromised ongoing national security investigations, endangered federal agents working undercover operations, and revealed law enforcement methods to criminal organizations. Sarah pulled up a new file on her laptop. Collins's financial records show payments from shell companies linked to organized crime, foreign nationals, and domestic terrorism investigations. He wasn't just taking bribes from insurance companies, he was selling federal intelligence to the highest bidders. James stared at the financial records, understanding that his veteran fraud investigation had accidentally uncovered a much larger conspiracy. Collins's gambling addiction had transformed him into a security breach that threatened the integrity of federal law enforcement across multiple agencies. "What does this mean for the veterans whose claims were denied?" James asked. Morrison's expression suggested that wasn't his primary concern. "Agent Hunt, the veteran fraud case will proceed through normal channels. But our focus has to shift to assessing and containing the national security damage Collins created." "Normal channels?" James's voice rose, despite his efforts to stay professional. "Sir, we're talking about 1,500 veterans whose legitimate claims were denied through criminal conspiracy. Normal channels means years of appeals and bureaucratic review while people who served their country continue to suffer." "That's not our responsibility," Morrison replied coldly. "Our responsibility is protecting national security and preserving the integrity of federal investigations." The room fell silent as agents processed the ethical implications of Morrison's directive. James felt the same vertigo he'd experienced during his undercover operation, the moment when institutional priorities diverged from human compassion, when bureaucratic efficiency took precedence over justice for real people. Agent Martinez cleared his throat carefully. "Sir, what about the veterans who trusted Agent Hunt during his undercover operation? They're going to expect some kind of resolution, some indication that their community wasn't infiltrated for nothing." Morrison's smile was thin and political. Agent Hunt's undercover operation successfully identified criminal fraud and led to multiple arrests. The veteran community should be grateful for federal law enforcement's commitment to protecting their interests. James wanted to laugh at the absurdity of Morrison's response, but the sound caught in his throat. The veteran community wasn't grateful. They were angry, betrayed, and suspicious of federal authorities who'd infiltrated their support networks. Miguel Santos's panic attack was just the beginning of the psychological damage the investigation had caused. "Sir," James said carefully, "the veteran community needs to understand that this investigation was about helping them, not exploiting them. If we limit prosecution to Derek Hoffman and Collins while ignoring the broader conspiracy, they'll see it as another institutional betrayal. The veteran community will see whatever the media tells them to see," Morrison replied, "which is why we need to control the narrative carefully." Sarah's laptop chimed with an urgent message. She read it quickly, her expression growing troubled. "Victoria Sterling just retained criminal defense counsel," Sarah announced. "High-profile firm specializing in federal white-collar defense. They're requesting a proffer meeting to discuss potential cooperation." Morrison leaned forward, his political instincts engaging. "That's interesting. Sterling's legal team wouldn't be requesting cooperation unless they're trying to get ahead of serious charges. Or unless they know about evidence we haven't discovered yet," James added. Agent Williams pulled up Sterling's financial records on the main display. "Her personal accounts show unusual activity over the past 6 months. Large cash withdrawals, transfers to offshore accounts, payment for services from companies that specialize in document destruction." The pattern was clear. Victoria Sterling had been preparing for this investigation long before Collins's betrayal exposed it. Her proffer request suggested she had information valuable enough to trade for reduced prosecution, which meant she knew about criminal activity beyond what they'd already uncovered. "Schedule a proffer meeting," Morrison ordered, "but make it clear that any cooperation agreement depends on full disclosure of her role in the conspiracy and complete information about other participants." As the task force meeting concluded, James remained in the conference room, studying the organizational chart that mapped the corruption network. Somewhere in that web of criminal relationships were answers about the broader conspiracy targeting veterans, but political pressure was pushing the investigation toward a narrow resolution that would leave most perpetrators unpunished. Elena Rodriguez and the veteran community deserved better than a bureaucratic compromise that protected institutional interests while abandoning the people who'd been systematically victimized. But James was beginning to understand that federal law enforcement priorities didn't always align with justice for the communities they were supposed to protect. The line between serving the system and serving the people had never felt more distinct or more impossible to navigate. 3 days after Morrison's directive to limit the investigation's scope, James sat in his wheelchair outside the Phoenix Veterans Community Center, watching through the window as Elena Rodriguez led an emergency meeting about the federal investigation's aftermath. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was once again observing from the outside, excluded from a community that had once welcomed him as family. His secure phone buzzed with another message from Sarah. Sterling's proffer meeting set for tomorrow. Morrison wants you to observe but not participate. Your undercover relationship with the veterans could compromise testimony. James deleted the message without responding. For 3 days, he'd watched federal priorities shift away from comprehensive justice toward damage control and political expediency. Victoria Sterling's cooperation would likely result in a few mid-level prosecutions, while the broader network remained intact, free to continue victimizing veterans through systematic fraud. Through the window, James could see Miguel Santos back. In the support group circle, his face still pale from the panic attack triggered by learning about James's deception. Elena was speaking to him with gentle intensity, probably helping him process the betrayal and trauma. Tommy Williams sat beside them, his weathered features serious as he contributed to what appeared to be a therapeutic conversation. The sight of Miguel's ongoing struggle crystallized something that had been building in James's mind since Morrison's briefing. The federal investigation would declare victory with Derek Hoffman's arrest and Collins's national security charges, but the veteran community would remain fractured, suspicious, and unhealed. The real victims of the conspiracy would be left to rebuild trust and seek justice through inadequate civilian channels. James's phone rang. Elena Rodriguez's number on the caller ID. His breath caught as he considered answering, uncertain what she would say or how he could possibly explain his choices. After a moment's hesitation, he accepted the call. James. Elena's voice was carefully controlled. We need to talk. I know you must hate me, James said quietly. I don't hate you. I'm trying to understand you. Elena paused, and James could hear the community center's background conversations through the phone. Rebecca Hoffman showed us the evidence she saved. We understand why the investigation was necessary, but that doesn't make the deception hurt less. James closed his eyes, feeling the weight of trust betrayed and relationships damaged by necessary lies. Elena, everything I told you about caring for this community, about wanting to help veterans, that was real. The only lies were about my identity. Were they? Elena's question was sharp. Because the James Hunt I knew wouldn't accept a limited federal response that leaves most of the conspiracy intact. He'd fight for comprehensive justice, even if it meant risking his career. The challenge in her voice triggered something James had been suppressing for days. Elena was right. The agent who'd spent months embedded in the veteran community wouldn't accept Morrison's political compromise. That man would risk everything to ensure the people who'd trusted him received the justice they deserved. What are you suggesting? James asked. Tommy and I have been reviewing Rebecca's evidence with veterans from the network. We've identified patterns the federal investigation missed, connections to other insurance companies, medical professionals who were systematically discredited. Elena's voice gained strength. We're building a comprehensive case for congressional hearings and media exposure, but we need someone who understands both the criminal evidence and the community impact. James understood what she was offering, a chance to choose the veteran community over federal bureaucracy, to risk his career for the comprehensive justice Morrison had abandoned. It would mean defying direct orders, potentially ending his law enforcement career and accepting whatever consequences came from putting principles before institutional loyalty. Elena, if I help you, I can't go back to federal law enforcement. And if you don't help us, can you live with watching a limited prosecution that leaves most of the conspiracy intact? The question hung between them, crystallizing the choice. James had been avoiding: serve the institution that employed him, or serve the community that had trusted him. Follow orders that protected political interests, or pursue justice that honored the veterans who'd been systematically betrayed. Through the community center window, James watched Miguel Santos stand to address the group, his young face determined despite recent trauma. Whatever the veteran was saying, his words were met with nods and murmurs of support from the assembled community. "What do you need from me?" James asked. 6 months after James Hunt made his choice to stand with the veteran community, the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee hearing room was packed with media, federal officials, and veterans whose stories would finally be heard. James sat at the witness table beside Elena Rodriguez and Rebecca Hoffman, his federal career sacrificed, but his conscience intact. Senator Patricia Williams, the committee chair and daughter of a Vietnam veteran, gavelled the hearing to order. "We're here today to examine systematic fraud in veteran disability claims, processing that denied benefits to over 1,500 service members and their families." James glanced toward the gallery where Miguel Santos sat with James Patterson and Tommy Williams, their presence a testament to the community's resilience and capacity for forgiveness. Miguel had recovered from his panic attack and become one of the most eloquent advocates for comprehensive reform. His trust in James slowly rebuilt through months of honest collaboration. "Agent Hunt," Senator Williams began, "you defied direct orders from federal supervisors to pursue this broader investigation. Explain your reasoning." James leaned toward the microphone, choosing his words carefully. "Senator, during my undercover investigation, I witnessed the human cost of systematic fraud. Veterans denied legitimate benefits, families thrust into poverty, young soldiers losing faith in the institutions they'd served. When federal priorities shifted toward political damage control, I chose to honor the trust the veteran community had placed in me." Elena squeezed his hand under the table, a gesture of support that 6 months ago would have felt like betrayal, but now represented the authentic relationship they'd built after his deception was exposed. Rebecca Hoffman was called next, her testimony revealing the full scope of her father's criminal network. Derek Hoffman sat in the gallery's defendant section, his expensive suit unable to disguise the hollow defeat in his eyes. Agent Collins had pled guilty to espionage charges and was serving 20 years in federal prison. "Ms. Rodriguez," Senator Williams addressed Elena, "describe the impact on veteran communities when trust in federal institutions is systematically betrayed." Elena's response was measured but powerful, describing how the investigation's exposure had initially shattered community trust, but ultimately demonstrated that some federal agents would risk their careers to protect veteran interests. Her advocacy organization had grown into a national network, using Rebecca's preserved evidence to expose similar fraud schemes across the country. As the hearing concluded, James felt a hand on his shoulder. Sarah Kim had quietly taken a seat behind him during the proceedings. "Morrison's furious," she said softly, "but the Attorney General is impressed. They're creating a new division for veteran advocacy cases, and they want you to head it." James looked toward the gallery, where the veteran community sat together, their presence a reminder of relationships rebuilt through honesty rather than deception. Miguel Santos caught his eye and offered a respectful nod. Forgiveness earned through months of authentic action rather than manufactured trust. "Thanks, Sarah," James said quietly, "but I think I am where I belong now." Elena's advocacy organization had offered him a position as their federal liaison, a role that would let him serve the veteran community without the institutional constraints that had nearly compromised his conscience. It meant lower pay, uncertain prospects, and the constant challenge of rebuilding trust with people he'd initially deceived. But it also meant waking up each morning knowing his work served real people rather than bureaucratic priorities, relationships built on truth rather than systematic lies, and justice measured by community healing rather than political convenience. The line between duty and humanity had finally become clear, and James Hunt had chosen to stand on the right side of it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.